Hello, and welcome to the show. As we often do on Mondays, we will tell you some things that will perhaps mildly frighten you. We're going to cheer you up right at the end. So just right when you're just curled into the fetal position, we're going to give you something amusing to think about. That thing will be French dressing. But before that, we do have some mildly... really, the first two-thirds of this show are going to basically ask the question, which season of 24 are we in? Because, if you watched 24, it would be definitely one of the Charles Logan seasons. We got a president who minimizes the activities of Russian espionage and wants to hold on to power long past the time when he should relinquish it. And we are going to talk about those two things. In the second segment, we'll talk about the fact that, yes, according to the New York Times, President Trump and some of his lawyers are talking with White House staffers about, is it so crazy to impose martial law? Would it be so bad if we just used the military to hold on to power? Would people really get that upset? Just spitballing the idea. Before that, though, we've been hacked. And when I say we, I mean a vast intelligence operation, the size and scope of which would have few rivals in history. But we're so busy worrying about other stuff that perhaps we haven't really thought or talked very much about this. So let's get going with that. And joining us today is Josephine Wolf, Assistant Professor of Cybersecurity Policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She's the author of You'll See This Message When It Is Too Late, great title, The Legal and Economic Aftermath of Cybersecurity Breaches. Josephine Wolf, welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So somebody, we won't point a finger quite yet, but somebody had the smart idea, as I understand it, Josephine Wolf, that yes, you could hack 18,000 different business and government entities in the United States one by one, ranging from Los Alamos nuclear facility to most Fortune 500 companies. Or you could hack one company that deals with 18,000 entities, that has software which requires updates, which would allow you to get them to voluntarily upload your hack so that you would have a backdoor into what they were doing. So is that what happened? Did our adversary, who shall at this point remain nameless, get us to kind of hack ourselves?
That's one way of thinking about it. Certainly there was a lot of work on their part too. This is what we would call a supply chain attack, right? They go after a downstream provider of services. And in this case, it's the SolarWinds Orion products, which are actually somewhat ironically a security monitoring tool. Mm-hmm. So the software that was being updated was a tool to sort of monitor your networks, make sure you were aware of any suspicious activity that was going on, help you figure out sort of if there were threats that were targeting you. And like all software that we use, it has to be updated periodically for various reasons, some security related, some otherwise. And what happened here was that some of those updates got compromised. So the sort of actual update that SolarWinds meant to be sending out was manipulated and posted with this malware included on it, so that when all of these different customers got the update from the company, they went ahead, they downloaded it the same way all the security people are always telling you to. Please download the updates, please download the updates. And in this case, that actually was the initial cause of the breach for many of these places.
That was the initial cause of the breach. You mentioned a lot of work. As I understand it, after the voluntarily and ignorantly uploading this malware and creating kind of a backdoor, then you've got a situation where the hackers do more labor-intensive work, right? Work that involves sitting down at a keyboard and using that backdoor to put even more stuff into these systems. So tell us about that.
Right. Well, we're still finding out sort of about the full extent of that. We have some ideas of what happened, right? We know that, for instance, there was monitoring of email accounts in the Department of Commerce happening within the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, a group that works on internet policy. So we've got some ideas so far of kind of what they were going after. And as you say, right, there's this first toehold, which comes from the compromised update. And then depending on what system you're in and what you most want to get access to, you're probably going to use that to install more malware, to monitor certain accounts or certain information that you're interested in. We know what some of that is. As I say, we know a little bit about what they were doing in the Department of Commerce. We know that in the security firm FireEye, they were stealing some of the tools that FireEye uses to run penetration tests and help secure its clients. We know that they were able to compromise some of the Microsoft services as well and use those to access Microsoft customers. So we're starting to get some sense of sort of how vast this was and the range of things that were going on. But I would say we're still probably at the very beginning of trying to unravel all of that.
Right. So, as I understand it too, part of the problem may be that the hackers have installed kind of the digital equivalent of sleeper cells that could wake up at some point in the future and start doing stuff that they are not currently doing, that there may be kind of time bombs sitting in some of these entities that were hacked?
Yeah, that's a very good way of thinking about it, because when you have sort of a more typical or a more low-key data breach, often it's a little bit easier to trace, right? If I steal your password and I use that to get into a computer system and do some bad stuff, then as soon as we find out about that, we kind of go back and say, okay, what did the person using your credentials do? And we can try and sort of clean that up and isolate it and get the system back up and running pretty securely afterwards. And in this case, because the access was not like one person's credentials were compromised or one small thing that went wrong that we can isolate, instead, I think the cleanup effort here, just because there are so many organizations and so much access that the adversaries had, is going to take a really long time. And we could still be seeing these kinds of compromises come up for years into the future.
So one of the more, operative theories, I mean, if not settled wisdom, something close to it, is that the hackers in question are from SVR. It's one of the Russian intelligence agencies. It's kind of the heir to the old KGB, the people who were running Philip and Elizabeth on the Americans. How certain or uncertain are we about who hacked us?
The intelligence that we've heard so far does seem to point pretty clearly to SVR. Of course, it's always possible that could shift, but many people at least seem to be fairly confident of that at this point. And it certainly makes sense with sort of what we know to be their interests and their motivations in terms of being a civilian intelligence agency, running much more kind of passive espionage operations rather than active offensive cyber operations, which we associate more with the GRU group from Russia.
So, I mean, that also suggests that although they, this hack went into a lot of, if not all, Fortune 500 companies and lots of other, private entities like that, they're not that interested in my 401k, probably, right? They're interested, they want United States intelligence secrets based on what you've seen so far?
Yeah, I think there's certainly an interest in intelligence secrets. There's also clearly a lot of interest in stuff happening in the private sector. But I think we're still not sure probably exactly how focused that is, or whether that's mostly about trying to use those private sector victims as a conduit to access other government victims, which you could also imagine being a piece of this.
Right. Well, we've seen kind of that happen. It's happening right now in a different context where China appears to have access to a lot of non-classified data, but it's like, sort of expense report kind of stuff. Who stays in Starwood hotels and Anthem stuff about health insurance, and just being able to layer that one thing on top of the other on top of the other. They're starting to figure out who the intelligence assets are in China that the U.S. has. So it is, you could almost say there's no such thing as innocuous data if you combine an awful lot of it. Josephine, I did want to ask, this started in March. It's December now. I mean, how is it possible that we didn't know about this until pretty recently?
It's a great question. And I think there are two ways of looking at that. One is to say this is unbelievably terrible and embarrassing and dangerous that we had malicious code on so many systems across the government, across private industry, and we didn't know about it. And I think the short answer to why didn't we know about it is because this was really, really sophisticated malware. This was malware that was embedded in a legitimate update that came from the actual company putting it out. It was done in such a way that that company was not aware of it at the time or for months afterwards. And we think the only reason we finally learn about it is because FireEye starts investigating its breach and is able to trace it back to this update. So I think the other way of thinking about this is, thank God we found out about it this soon. Right. Even though it's been a very long time and probably a lot of damage has been done, you could imagine something like this lasting years and years and years before anybody figured out what was going on.
Right. You could almost say, thank God they picked FireEye as one of their targets.
Yeah, I think that's actually true, that they get a little bit sort of overconfident in who they think they can target and end up targeting a victim that is really well equipped to find out that they've been breached, to investigate that breach, and to shine light on what's happened.
But Josephine Wolf, that raises the question about whether the U.S. government is well equipped to find out similar things. Let's hear Chris Krebs, former director of the somewhat redundantly named Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. That's 3 uses of the word security. He's talking to Jake Tapper on State of the Union about this whole question of whether the federal government is as adept and well prepared as, say, FireEye.
The federal civilian agencies, the 101 civilian agencies, are not really optimized for defense right now. And what that means is there's a lot of old, antiquated legacy IT systems that are hard to defend. Plus, the authorities are not in place for teams like CISA to really get out there and aggressively root out adversaries. Now, there is a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act, that's the annual defense bill that's sitting on the president's desk waiting for his signature, that would give CISA, my old agency, the authorities to go out and really aggressively hunt and look for these adversaries. And that's what we're going to have to do to get certainty and to the other side of this, is really deep diving into these agency systems, looking for the Russians and going hand-to-hand combat almost with them and getting them out of those systems.
So Josephine Wolf, that's Christopher Krebs, who, of course, got fired from his job for doing it. But, he's making an interesting point, which I've heard elsewhere, too, which is that the U.S. is a little bit better, or maybe a lot better, on the cyber front at being a hammer than it is at being a shield. In other words, we might know how to go after, say, some of Iran's secrets, or maybe go after China's, but maybe in the way that he's talking about, we haven't really played defense very well. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would actually say, going a little bit further even, there's been a real shift in the past few years on the part of the U.S. government to basically saying that their approach to defense is going to be offense. And there was a shift in the sort of strategy towards what's sometimes called defend forward, in which the whole point was going to be that the United States was going to be in our adversaries' networks and able to sort of respond and retaliate and use that to deter adversaries from infiltrating our own networks. And it was, a controversial strategy, I think, when it was first put forward. There's been a sense that it's been successful in some things, like trying to help protect elections since 2016. But there's also, I think, a way in which it has really led to a lot of oversight around kind of the defense as opposed to the offensive defense. And I think that's sort of what Krebs is getting at here. And I would agree with him that one of the things you see when you look at the SolarWinds compromise is that people weren't paying attention. People weren't paying attention all across many different agencies and departments in the government, and did not feel a sort of strong sense of responsibility or a lot of incentive to focus on security.
Is there more than just an intuitive connection between this hack and the fact that, we all had our breaths held, really from starting around March and going through November, about a possible outside hack of our election system? And at the end of it, God knows, as we will be mentioning in the second segment, our election segment has been audited and scrutinized very carefully. And there was sort of a sigh of relief. Wow, the Russians didn't get in here and mess with our election system. Is it possible that we were so worried about that this happened, or would this have just happened anyway?
It's a hard question to answer. I think it's certainly true that, there are finite resources in the government, especially for thinking about civilian cybersecurity and monitoring various types of threats. And probably they were rightfully very focused on the election this year. And that may in turn have meant that there were fewer resources or fewer people who were able to focus on some of these other types of threats. I do think that some of this type of sort of very sophisticated supply chain based espionage would be happening, or at least would be being attempted regardless. But certainly there was a sense, and I was, somebody who had the sense as well a few weeks ago of we made it through the sort of biggest cybersecurity test of 2020 relatively unscathed. And to then realize that all that time we had actually been sort of experiencing one of the most sophisticated cyber espionage campaigns ever was pretty disheartening.
So it's usually a mistake to fight the last war. We clearly, as Krebs is suggesting, as you are suggesting, need to get on our game in terms of defense. But I assume that defense needs to be thought about in a much broader sense than just how do we stop the next Russian hack. So what do we do in a way that lay people can understand to make ourselves better at keeping this stuff out?
So I think one of the things that this particular incident makes really clear is we need to be taking much, much more seriously the question of who are all of the different vendors and suppliers that each of us relies on for our software and our hardware, and how do we kind of, in a manageable, realistic way, try to vet their security and make sure that these compromises coming in through the supply chain can't spread as rapidly as they did in this case. And I think that could mean a bunch of different things. One thing it almost certainly means is trying to reduce the number of vendors and third-party suppliers that we rely on in the federal government, trying to get that down to a number where we feel we can effectively audit their security practices and be confident in what they're doing. Another thing it means is probably paying a lot more attention throughout the procurement process to issues like not just sort of what's the price for this piece of software I'm buying, but also do I understand who's been writing it and how it's being protected and what kinds of safeguards are in place. So I think we're hopefully going to see a lot more attention to that moving forward, as well as a lot sort of more significant penalties and incentives for government agencies to actually respond to the vulnerabilities that are brought up in audits that are brought to their attention around their information security, because otherwise we can keep sort of having these audits and saying this agency has not met these standards, this department is not secure. But if they don't actually act on that, then it doesn't really matter.
Right. So, and some other suggestions that have come forward. Alex Stamos from the Stanford Internet Observatory has talked a lot about we need more transparency. We need kind of the cybersecurity equivalent of the NTSB. When we have one of these things, it can be investigated to death in a way that is shared with everybody, maybe hold companies harmless from litigation if they come forward and say we've been hacked. But one last question for you. We've been talking to Josephine Wolf, assistant professor of cybersecurity policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and the author of You'll See This Message When It Is Too Late, the legal and economic aftermath of cybersecurity breaches. So the truth is, I don't know anything about any of this stuff except what I've learned about it through popular culture. And so, but one of the things that I know from Battlestar Galactica is that you can be kind of over-networked. You can be not air-gapped enough. One reason that they didn't get into the super classified stuff is that stuff is air-gapped. And I'm wondering if, and this is like a hard thing I think to ask you to pronounce on, but like, are we just, the fact that solar wind could hit unintentionally 18,000 private and government targets, and constantly updating the SolarWinds software. Does that mean, well, I'll just say that, do we need to be a little bit less networked somehow?
I think we certainly need to be careful about what kinds of information are networked and what pieces of our computer systems are online. And I don't think that means that sort of we're going to take the government agencies offline. And I don't think that would be a productive direction to go in. But I do think it makes sense to say sort of, are there certain resources, certain kinds of data that we shouldn't be keeping connected? This is sometimes called network segmentation, where you divide up a network and you say, okay, this piece needs to be super secure, this needs to be air gapped, or it needs to be sort of behind some extra protections. And I do think that will be sort of a part of recovering from this and thinking about how we move forward.
All right. Well, you've been a terrific guest and a terrific help. Thank you so much for sharing time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We're going to take a break. Now, you probably know that the president has said that he doesn't really think Russia might be that 400-pound guy sitting in his bedroom somewhere that he used to talk about. And he's also been thinking, I don't know, do I really have to leave? So we'll talk to a guy who saw this coming. In fact, he saw it coming on our show quite a few months ago.
I'm just an average man with an average life. I work from 9 to 5. Hey, hell, I pay the price. All I want is to be left alone in my average home. But why do I always feel like I'm in the twilight zone? And I always feel like somebody's watching me. And I have no privacy.
So if you're listening live, you just heard the promo. It's just strange to hear Alec Baldwin say my name. There's just something, it just doesn't fit my life somehow. But anyway, it's very exciting. He's very nice to do that too. All right. So back in June, we brought on the show a guy named Lawrence Douglas, who is the James J. Grossfeld Professor of Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought at Amherst College. His book, published in May, Will He Go? Trump and the Looming Electoral Meltdown in 2020. Boy, I hope you pre-ordered that book, because it turns out it's the manual you needed to get through the fall. It predicted the exact outcome of the 2020 election. He's back with us now. We want to kind of take the temperature of this situation, and specifically about some news that broke over the weekend. Lawrence Douglas, welcome back to our show.
Pleasure to be with you again, Colin.
All right. So, you and Lawrence Wright, you guys see around corners or something. So I wanted to ask specifically, and then we can get into the general, but there was a story that broke in the New York Times over the weekend that suggested that some of Trump's more rabid legal supporters and people like that, the people who've been kind of orchestrating the attempt to discredit the election, met in the White House with President Trump, some of his more conventional staff. Michael Flynn was apparently invited because he had been on some conservative show talking about, what about martial law, and apparently somebody said, let's get Michael in here to talk about that whole idea. So they had a conversation that would have just terrified the crap out of everybody, 2 or 3 years ago. I feel like we're so inured to this, that the president can actually entertain, even hypothetically maybe, something like martial law, something like having Sidney Powell become a special counsel and run around using the military to seize voting machines and stuff like that. And it's just sort of like another day at the bank. But what was your reaction to all that?
Well, I suppose it's not dissimilar to yours, Colin. I mean, I guess I was kind of shocked and unsurprised. I mean, shocked in as much as it is kind of astonishing to imagine the president listening to this disgraced and convicted and ultimately pardoned former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn floating this nutty idea of declaring martial law and then having the American military basically oversee a rerunning of the election. It's just such a nutty idea, and yet unsurprising, I suppose, because it's of a piece of everything that we've seen of this president. It reminded me a little bit of that scene in, in the book Catch-22, where the general says, "Take this guy out and shoot him," and his assistant says, "Excuse me, General, you actually can't do that." And the general's like, "I can't? No, you actually can't." And apparently there were some sober voices in the room. There were, again, these sober voices, we should put, quotation marks around the notion of sober. I mean, these are people who have been enablers of Trump for months and even years, and yet still they were pushing back against Flynn's kind of wild suggestion about declaring martial law, telling the president actually there's no constitutional basis for him to do so.
All right, so let's actually hear what that sounds like a little bit, coming from not the horse's mouth, specifically from former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. He's on the Greg Kelly show on Newsmax's Greg Kelly Reports. I confess, I don't know what that is, but he is talking about the options available to the president.
The president has to plan for every eventuality, because we cannot allow this election and the integrity of our election to go the way it is. I mean, this is just totally unsatisfactory. There's no way in the world that we are going to be able to move forward as a nation with this. So The president has and I just mentioned one of the options. I mean, he could immediately, on his order, seize every single one of these machines around the country on his order. He could also order, within the swing states, if he wanted to, he could take military capabilities and he could place them in those states and basically rerun an election in each of those states. I mean, it's not unprecedented. I mean, these people out there talking about martial law, it's like it's something that we've never done. Martial law has been instituted 64 times, Greg.
But not for the purpose of redoing an election. So that was the interview that got him another invite into the circle to have that conversation. Lawrence Douglas, I don't remember every jot and tittle of the conversation we had back in June, but I know we did talk about, well, would the military get involved? Which way would the military get involved? Would they get involved to stop something like that, or would they get involved to suborn it in some way or to cooperate with it? I mean, how, as you read the waters now, how does that look?
Yeah, I don't see that there's any danger whatsoever of the military intervening right now to try to overturn the results of the election. I mean, for one thing, we can take a little bit of cold comfort in the fact that it's fair to say that the military apparatus, the senior leadership of the military in the United States, probably all consider Trump unfit for higher office. And let's also bear in mind, I mean, obviously something that Flynn failed to mention is that the electors have already met in all their respective states. I mean, this took place on December 14th. So the electoral votes have already been cast. Biden is the president-elect of the United States. Now, it is true that technically Trump remains the commander-in-chief until January 20th. And so, the military would follow orders coming from the commander-in-chief, but not military orders which dramatically fly in the face of the constitutional responsibilities of the president.
So, one bullet, so to speak, that we dodged was one of the things that you had wondered about, which was, would the president try to substitute a different set of electors for the ones who were supposed to be participating in the Electoral College, and kind of setting off a bizarro world civics class debate about this. That's not what happened. What happened was a bunch of feckless and hapless lawsuits that didn't really go anywhere, and some other feints and motions towards other kinds of remedies. But it seems as though, to your point about the electors having now been chosen, anything that comes after this, which doesn't amount to an orderly transition of power, is a coup, right? I mean, there isn't like a card he can play that sits anywhere within the Overton window of what we think of as American civic function.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's also something we should bear in mind when we think about the suggestion that was issuing from General Flynn. I mean, basically what he was talking about was he was advocating a coup. He was basically advocating the military stepping in to overturn the results of a democratically conducted election. And, you point out that, on one level, you're absolutely right to say that we've dodged a bullet in the sense that the worst possible scenarios did not thankfully manifest themselves. On the other hand, I'm not sure if we've entirely dodged the damage because obviously the president continues to inflict, pretty dramatic damage upon our constitutional democracy in as much as he continues to malign the outcome of what was all said and done, a kind of remarkably smooth and fairly conducted election. And, we're going to continue to probably see some of this fallout from his attacks on our election on January 6th. January 6th is the date that Congress convenes in a joint session to basically ratify the votes that the electors in the respective states conducted on December 14th. And we're going to see some of Trump's supporters try to contest the ratification of the Electoral College vote on January 6th. And again, it's another kind of very ugly thing for our country to have to experience.
Yes, and not to minimize that at all, Lawrence, but it does appear at least I defer to you on this, but it seems as though if you see the stuff that McConnell is saying right now, that there wouldn't really be any kind of leadership-backed attempt at nullification or a refusal to ratify.
That's exactly right. That is, to the extent that you have, I'll even call them kind of some of these rogue Republicans who are willing to challenge the certification of these electoral college votes on January 6th. There's no chance that that's actually going to result in anything other than Biden being our next president. But what it will continue to do is it will continue to erode the faith of tens of millions of Americans in the integrity of our electoral system. And it's really hard to imagine, Colin, that our democracy can function in the years to come if Americans lose that basic faith in our electoral processes.
Yeah, and with you're saying that, I'll ask you a question that I asked somebody last week. I'm chagrined to say I can't remember who I asked, but I know I did ask it. So if I were to say to you, Lawrence, that I think that 2 years from now there will be a significant secessionist movement in this country, maybe even led by the Attorney General of Texas or some of the other kind of people who attempted to discredit this, free and fair election, and whose lingering dissatisfaction with the results has enabled them to whip up quite a bit of popular support for the idea of pulling away somehow. I'm not saying it would happen, but there would be, a movement of note. Would you try to talk me out of that point of view, or would you join me in it?
I guess that is not the kind of the little alarms that go off inside my head. Mm-hmm. The secessionist movement, which I agree. I mean, you've already seen people starting to float this idea. That's not really the danger that keeps me up at night. I'm much more concerned that basically you have all these Republican lawmakers who have signed on to a anti-democratic agenda, mm-hmm. to an agenda that basically stands for the proposition that we recognize electoral outcomes when we win, and we emphatically reject them when we lose. And I really just worry that in the years to come, that script will be repeated and improved upon by whoever comes in the wake of Donald Trump, could be even Donald Trump himself. And that's what I really do worry about, that we will, as a nation, lose faith in our democratic processes, which makes us all the more vulnerable to the kind of autocratic acts that Trump really has tried to engage in the wake of this November's election.
So last question, and it is similar to a question I asked you back in June. I want you to tell me your most probable scenario for January 20th. Are we talking about the president books it out of here 2 or 3 days early and moves to a country with no extradition to the U.S.? Are we talking about he goes to the inauguration and frowns all the way through it? He refuses to vacate the White House on that particular day at the particular scheduled time? I mean, what does Inauguration Day look like to you?
Well, I think it's fair to say that he's not going to flee the country. He's not going to kind of take up residence, in some kind of swank penthouse with a view onto the Kremlin. I think that's fair to say. I think it's also a pretty fair bet to say that he will boycott the inauguration. He's not going to be there. In fact, I could easily imagine him staging some kind of parallel event meant simply to draw attention away from Biden and actually simply to underscore to his tens of millions of supporters that Biden is an illegitimate president. I could also imagine him tarrying when it comes to leaving the White House. That is, not leaving, I do think that ultimately he will leave the White House, but I could see him just kind of provocatively hanging around so that he's not out on January 20th, but makes up some kind of excuse as to why he's not leaving until the 21st or the 22nd. And that basically all goes to the way of him demonstrating to his supporters that I have chosen to leave the White House, meaning that I might have chosen otherwise, as opposed to I am submitting to a necessary reality of my defeat.
You know what reform? I had Jack Goldsmith on here a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about various things that should change. The one that we didn't come up with, but I think, we need the law. In the future, presidents should have to pay security deposits for the White House. And if they don't get their crap out of there by Inauguration Day, they should lose their security deposit. And that would really motivate Trump, too. It's the kind of thing that really bothers him.
Yeah, I wish it would, Colin, except I do think that, he's raised about $250 million since the election. And so I think he would probably have adequate funds to dip into in order to pay whatever kind of fine he would have to, or whatever kind of security deposit he might forfeit by lingering in the White House.
Well,
but I like the idea.
He owes $420 million, so we don't know that he has enough money. All right, we have to stop there. It's always a great fun. I don't know, fun is probably the wrong word when we're talking about democracy hanging in the balance and trying to figure out what episode of 24 we're actually in. But it is always very enlightening to talk to Lawrence Douglas, James J. Grossfeld, professor of law, jurisprudence and social thought at Amherst College. His book in May was published, Will He Go? Trump and the Looming Electoral Meltdown in 2020. Thanks for being with us again.
My pleasure to be with you again, Colin.
All right. So we're going to take a break. I promised you we would end with something less traumatic. Unless, in fact, salad dressing is such a pivotal area of your life that you'll find this more traumatic. And if that's so, that's on you, all right? I'm not going to feel bad about that.
Grass is growing. It's time to move on. Time to get going. Broken skyline.
All right, so it's time to thank the people who are the keys to this show. I am just merely a cog in their machine. I'm just going to see if I can guess what kind of salad dressing they use. I'm going to say the Cat Pastor, who kind of runs everything there at the studio, makes sure the show actually happens. I'm thinking ranch. I feel like she might be a ranch. And then Betsy Kaplan, senior producer of this show, she probably makes her own salad dressing, and it's probably like whoops, I was wrong about ranch. She probably makes her own salad dressing, Betsy Kaplan, and it doesn't have anything evil in it or anything like that. It's probably like, almost no olive oil and then some kind of very puritanical form of vinegar. That would be my theory. All right. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk to Michael Levinson, who reports for the New York Times Express Desk. He wrote a piece this weekend about the FDA. It turns out that the FDA does two things. They approve vaccines for COVID-19 and they regulate salad dressing. That's about it. That's their entire portfolio. Which is not true. But first of all, Michael Levinson, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And in fact, the FDA has they are perched on the edge of a landmark move as regards French dressing. Explain this to us.
Right. Well, first of all, it's news to me that the FDA even regulates French dressing, but they do. Since 1950, they've mandated certain ingredients be included in French dressing and hundreds of other foods. But lo and behold, they are now about to get rid of those regulations at the request of an industry group called the Association for Dressings and Sauces. So they're freeing up industry to make whatever kind of French dressing they like.
This feels like, Michael, something that some K Street lobbying firm got paid a lot of money for, right? There's somebody in the industry said, take off the shackles, let us make whatever we want to call French dressing. Is it that kind of thing?
I think it is exactly that kind of thing. This is one of those regulations that's been on the books for years, decades in this case, and it really doesn't gain a lot of public attention, but for a certain part of the salad dressing industry, it's a big deal. You have to now include 35% vegetable oil in your French dressing recipe, according to federal regulations. And that's a problem for, big companies that want to make salad dressing with less oil or make other formulations, low fat, light, fat free. I also talked to one critic who said this is just a way for the industry to stick more junk into the recipe.
Right. Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. And it initially, when you sort of see their reasoning, it almost seems somewhat Socratic in nature. I mean, and essentially what they say is these regulations are not really necessary to establish what French dressing is, that this will not result in French dressing being put out that's made of all kinds of very counterintuitive ingredients, that won't result in French dressings that do not in any way correspond to our Platonic notion of what a French dressing is. But I don't know. That seems also like it might be BS.
The FDA said that the public basically expects French dressing to have a red or reddish color, to be sweet, and that's kind of it. You see it on the store shelves. You might toss it in your cart if you like that kind of dressing. But the point of these standards is to ensure that you're getting some minimum basic quality in your foods. And when you take that off, it does open the door for all sorts of other ingredients to go in there. At least now you're going to get the three basic rules, according to the federal government now, are that you need vegetable oil and then some kind of acid like vinegar, lemon, or lime juice. So at least you're getting that in your bottle. Once these guardrails come off, French dressing could include potentially anything else that the industry would like to put in there. We'll see, what happens with French dressing over the next couple of years once the rules come off. But it doesn't seem like, we'll just leave it at that.
Well, not to see a pattern where none is there, but there was also a notification, I think, within the same time frame about ditching frozen cherry pie regulations. And they made essentially the same argument. They said, everybody knows what a cherry pie is to a sufficient degree that the FDA doesn't have to say what a cherry pie is. Is this also kind of the last gasp of Trump-era deregulation?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. This is part of these are sort of two small little areas of a larger project of trying to deregulate all across the government. There's some huge areas of environmental regulations that have been loosened, and all sorts of other standards. And here, obviously, two little corners of industry have an interest in frozen cherry pies and French dressing, and they're getting in their wish list from the FDA right before the Trump administration exits.
It seems like such an odd thing, too. It seems like such a niche thing. I mean, I think you point out in your article, French dressing is no longer really, anywhere near the top of the batting order of dressings. And, even if Cat Pastor doesn't like ranch dressing, we live in a ranch dressing world these days. I mean, it just seems a little peculiar that there'd be this carve out specifically about French dressing. Are there any theories about why that would have happened?
French dressing, I think, was at the time in 1950 that it was put on the books with these regulations, sort of a more popular dressing. And since then, ranch has become the undisputed heavyweight champion of salad dressings. 40% of Americans say it's their favorite. The next closest is Italian dressing at 10%. So the people that make French dressing have complained that there's no regulations for ranch dressing. There's nothing for Italian. So why are we subjected to these onerous, burdensome rules of how we have to make French dressing? They feel like they're being unfairly singled out, and they want some parity with the other kind of salad dressings.
They want the freedom to bottle anything and say, this is French dressing, the way they're interested.
Freedom dressing. Yeah.
Right, freedom dressing, exactly. That's as Sean Hannity has on his salads. So, I guess the other thing that struck me, well, there was a person that you quoted, I think it was a nutritionist or a nutrition scientist, and at the end of the article, she said something like, people just could make their own dressings, but don't get me started on that. And it kind of did get me started on that. The first thing that I did is I looked at dressings, and I realized, some of them are they're unhealthy. First of all, there are a lot of, particularly anything that's called ranch buttermilk or buttermilk ranch dressing. It's not uncommon for 2 tablespoons of it to contain 180 calories. That there really is. If people are using bottled salad dressing, and I know that's not necessarily this huge area of expertise that you've spent years cultivating, that this is kind of a new topic for you. There is sort of a caveat emptor thing, right? You should probably actually, instead of just accepting the FDA's assurances that you're not going to get some weird stuff in your bottled salad dressing, you should probably actually be on the lookout for what's in it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other complaint that the nutritionist I spoke to said, and the public health professor I spoke to said, is that these dressings are already stuffed with all sorts of chemicals and crazy ingredients that you might not recognize, if you saw them. And she said, why not just toss some oil and vinegar together? It's, it's probably cheaper, it might be tastier, and it's certainly more helpful. I think there's a point there, but there are people that really love ranch dressing, especially, has just gone through the roof. People dip anything in ranch dressing these days, and I think French dressing has its own little following as well. It's one of these like sweet foods that people just love to put anything into. And so whether Americans will start making their own homemade vinaigrettes, I don't know, but it is the plea from the public health perspective.
It's certainly, I pulled up a site right away. I mean, I basically do make my own kind of salad dressing, but I bet you I could make a pretty good salad dressing too that wouldn't be 180 calories. So tonight I will be making maybe a slightly more ambitious and elaborate. Betsy Kaplan, turns out, puts balsamic vinegar and oil on her salads. That's what I put on too. But after everything that you've learned about this, if you had a salad in the next 2 or 3 days, what would you put on it?
I am in that camp that I make my own. I put olive oil, vinegar, a little mustard, salt and pepper together, and I think it's quite good. And it's pretty fast. So that's what I do. But I have learned a lot about salad dressing in the course of reporting the story. I know we have other reporters that are covering the FDA's approval of, coronavirus vaccines and hugely world historical developments. So it was interesting for me to burrow in and learn a lot about salad dressing regulation.
It actually, I think, provided a welcome relief for a lot of us. And so I do want to say, but yeah, and one final observation about this. I think one thing that people think is that if you're putting a thing on something that's healthy, like salad, so you've got a bunch of mixed, field greens and some sliced up carrots and some other stuff, that if you put something on it, that's healthy too. Well, but that's not really the case. If you put like unhealthy stuff on your healthy stuff, you're going in the wrong direction. Michael Levinson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Michael Levinson reports for the New York Times Express desk. So I've got a minute or two here, I think. Yeah, I think I have 1 or 2 minutes here. So let me just tell you what the plan is for the next couple of days. Tomorrow, I'm going to be recording for a future broadcast, a show that we do every year on the best jazz recordings. We always do it with the same 3 mavens. They're more than mavens, but so Gene Seymour, Jen Allen, and of course Noah Behrman. And I've looked at the list that they've come up with. We'll be playing a lot of that music for you. I think it's going to run between the holidays, but it's really great this year. It's in fact the kind of nourishing and enriching music that you do want to hear. So we're excited about that. On Wednesday, I had to reschedule the nose from last Friday. So on Wednesday, we're going to do the nose right before the holidays. We are going to talk definitely about Tenet, and we're discussing whether we should add Ma Rainey's Black Bottom to that. We'll also be doing the Wheelhouse on Wednesday. It's going to be a busy 3 days or so, but we've got a lot of stuff that we want to get done for you before the holidays and stuff that we can run between the holidays. So, and also I also wanted to say that we had a really nice fund drive last week, and a lot of you called up and pledged during our show and said nice things about the show and stuff like that, and I am forever grateful. And it really meant a lot to get that kind of help. So thanks for doing that. So yeah, stay with us this week. We'll have, I don't know what's actually on the air tomorrow, but something will be airing while I'm recording this jazz show. It's going to be, it's the Kurt Anderson interview. Actually, that will really button on pretty nicely to the conversations we had with Lawrence Douglas just now. So get ready for an interesting week. Thanks for listening today. I hope we didn't scare you too much. And make your own salad dressing tonight. Don't get that stuff out of the bottle. Also, I have another question. Why is there suddenly white balsamic vinegar? Like, why would there be white balsamic vinegar? Who decided we needed white balsamic vinegar? It doesn't even seem right or possible. All right, that's all.
The salad or the sauce on the side, I don't know if you mind, but would you like the sauce in the salad or the sauce on the side? The sauce in the salad or the sauce on the side?
I don't care. You can put it anywhere.